Okay, hello and welcome. Thank you for joining us for this episode of Field Stories, which is especially exciting because we're talking about another podcast or webcast, which is very, very important. We have with us today Alyssa A.L. James and Brendane Tynes of Zora's Daughters podcast. Alyssa is a third-year anthropology PhD student in the Department of Anthropology at Columbia University. She is a 2020 Shirk Doctoral Fellow whose research examines the consequences of recasting colonial history for Caribbean subjectivities and futures. Her research interrogates the discourses and practices that transform commodities into heritage and history into commodity, and as it unfolds through Martinique nascent coffee revival projects. So that's, wow. Brendane is a fourth-year anthropology PhD candidate in the Department of Anthropology at Columbia, and a 2018 Ford Foundation pre-doctoral fellow whose research centers on effective experiences of Black women and girls in the movement for Black lives. Her research stands at the intersections of affect theory, anthropology, and Black studies, with a particular emphasis on Black feminist anthropological theory and praxis. And in her free time, she enjoys writing, poetry, and dancing. And you can find her latest essay, How Do We Listen to the Living, in Anthropology News. We'll link that below so people can access it. And so they've come together with this amazing podcast called Zora's Daughters, which follows the legacy of Zora, Neale, Hurston, and other Black women ethnographers. And they really bring a critical anthropological lens to popular topics and aim to combat the erasure and silencing of Black women's voices and experiences through discussion and uplifting of each other and the community. So thank you both for being here. Really appreciate your time and lending yourself to this conversation. Maybe you can tell us just initially a little bit about the podcast, how it got started, and in general, sort of, I know you've got several episodes under your belt with covering an array of topics, but maybe you could just give us a kind of a point of entry in your own words about this work that you do.
Yes, thank you so much for having us.
Thank you. Thank you.
We're really happy to be here, and I think that you're doing, and I'm sure Brendane agrees, but I think that you're doing really important work, and we appreciate it out here in the anthropology space.
Yes, for sure. And yeah, thank you again. Honestly, I mean, giving me a reason to put some makeup on and be in front of the screen is always, I'm always grateful for that. But I would say that, how do we start this? Alyssa and I are friends in real life, actually. And we chat daily, and I think she just texted me and was just like, so I had this idea. And I was like, okay, ideas. I love those. What is it? She was just like, I want to do a podcast. What do you think? And I was just like, of course, I'm always going to hype you up. I'm a hype person. So I'm like, I'm going to hype her up. And so we just started thinking about, okay, I think Alyssa really just had more of a plan. It wasn't an idea. It was actually a whole plan. And
I just had a name. It actually started with the name. And I was like, Zora's Daughters, what a cool name for a podcast. And then I think both of us kind of created the concept around it together. We're going to have to get our story straight eventually.
One day. we'll have to have a soundbite story.
The dry run.
Yeah.
But I would say, I mean, honestly, Alyssa really came with this idea, this name, and we were just like, okay, Zora's Daughters, we both are Black feminist thinkers. We're both learning. So we're like, okay, how do we make this? And we both have encountered readings and writings that were like, okay, what does this mean? What are these people talking about? And we both love public scholarship and just taking the academy and breaking through I would say the walls of the ivory tower and bringing things outwards, because that's really what Black feminist thinking is about, right? And so that's what we did with this podcast. And I feel like every day I'm learning something new about myself. Like the other day we were just talking about how even doing this and putting ourselves out there is giving us more confidence and courage to put ourselves out there more. And I don't know if you've experienced this too with doing fieldwork initiatives. But as a survivor of violence, I always feel kind of hesitant to put myself out there, be seen, because, the backlash might lash back, and that's an inside joke, but the backlash might lash back, but it's
I like that one. I might steal that. That's a good
Cite Black women.
You know, like, and it's like, you know, and we're Black women, so it's just like, okay, how is this going to be received? Who is going to really want to hear us? I know we both we're sitting with like, who's going to listen to us? We're still in graduate school, and now it's like actually hundreds of people have listened to us, and that's, I don't know, Alyssa, I'm like, every time I think about it, I'm like, this is wild. Like,
no, seriously, I think that we stepped into like the perfect storm, I think, because there were so many things happening at the time when we came up with the idea. You know, all of the uprisings around, you know, these racial reckonings and the pandemic, and then things happening within our own university, our departments. And, you know what, actually at the time, you know, we were thinking about what we would like to demand from our department and from the university. And one of the things that we did talk about as a group, and the we that I'm talking about is Brendane, myself, and other Black students in the department, was that there actually isn't any system of or any kind of recourse for sexual violence experienced in the field. And that was, so that was one of the things that we kind of were thinking about, and didn't really understand why there was no formal process for students or faculty to follow should one of us be harmed in the field. And I think that, you know, we need support in the field, and to really start thinking about what happens if we do choose to leave the field because of some kind of harm or violence that we've experienced. And a lot of faculty members don't really have the resources to talk to us about how we can kind of adjust or rework our projects without penalty.
yes.
So yeah, I think that was good.
Absolutely.
So lots of stuff are happening.
Absolutely. One of the things that just like makes, you know, me go crazy is when we have somebody that comes forward, and it's maybe, for example, about racism in the field, which it's a global reality, and you know, we will reach out to the department and say the student needs support. This is not okay that this is happening, and the classic response is like, oh, so-and-so wrote about racism in fieldwork. So-and-so wrote about sexual harassment. Why don't you reach out to them? And it's like, yes, things have been written about this. We know that this is, but at what point, like, does the action of like stepping in? It's kind of similar to like diversity statements, like we support, but like nothing is done. Which is why things like this, like having conversations outside of the, you know, kind of pulling the monopoly away from the academy of like, you know, where these institutions happening is so important. And so like the lack of action is really a problem, like honestly, as you've stated. What about for your own work, have you gotten a good amount of support, institutional support? Is this something you're being cheerleaded, you know, or have you faced any difficulties in getting it, you know, taken off or anything like that, you know, having it be produced? I'm sure you do it all on your own. I'm amazed at the savviness of tech savviness. But how has it been? Yeah.
I was going to say
everything. We do everything
yes,
ourselves.
We do.
Except the transcription. We do have two Black women transcriptionists that we are able to hire thanks to like an incredible amount of donations from the community.
Yes.
But everything else is just us on our computers Googling things. How do we do this? What do we need to do next? So
that's what I was getting at. I was like, has there been support? Like, because we see the most impactful work is done on the backs of unfunded survivors and members of communities. And so, things need funding. That's just my plug. But go ahead. Sorry.
I mean, we've also had some really great support from some of our professors.
I would say though, I would say in the terms of my own research topic, and Alyssa, maybe you had different experiences, but because my research centers the experiences of Black women who are survivors of sexual violence and Black girls who are survivors of sexual violence, initially in the context of like activist spaces. So when I would talk about my project as a first year PhD student, I would get pushback of people being like, well, does that really happen in activist spaces? Like, people experience that kind of violence in activist spaces? And I was like, yeah, this is how I know you're not an activist, because you know, you've never been in an activist space if you don't understand that unless people are actively against or anti-gender oppression or anti-racist, those types of systems will replicate themselves in activist spaces, especially radical leftist spaces, and that tend to, be for any type of like liberation. But yeah, so initially just like feeling really unsupported or feeling that my project wasn't really anthropological, and I was being told that by certain professors, certain experts in the field, inside and outside of our department. And it really wasn't until I got the Ford grant that I think a lot of that was quieted. Like when I was funded, when Ford decided to take the chance on me, I guess, whatever, however you want to say it, was when a lot of the questions around the legitimacy of my research was quieted. But I would say that like definitely for the podcast, what has been really amazing has been the level of support and just kind of, I think Alyssa described it perfectly, saying we entered in a perfect storm because we were both kind of like tired and exhausted, and we're like, the world is such a trash place, and what can we do to intervene on the trashness of the world? And we're like, well, I mean, we have a voice, we have computers. Alyssa is much more tech savvy than me. I will admit it. I know how to open a Word document and type into it. And that's really the extent of my of my expertise with computers. But I'm learning. But yeah, like we just kind of were like, this is going to be the way that we intervene in this moment. And it's been such a blessing, honestly, for me, especially during this time. It's been a blessing for sure.
Yeah, this explains one of your titles, Basura en Fuego, right? The world is just on fire, and we're really living crazy times. But yeah, so much. I mean, echoing absolutely everything that you've said is legitimacy and like imposter syndrome about what work is like valued and such, and like for some reason funding or certain backing, suddenly you become worthy of something to say. But this fear that we have, especially just as like early career academics, like who would care what we have to say, or like who am I to start an initiative or like make these? But that's exactly what's it's so important, because I think most of the valuable experiences and insights come from individuals like at that level where they're seeing the problems of the older, structures and such. And it's sort of even symbolically the idea of doing this work, despite, titles or any of those things, like it's really pushing back against this sort of classism and rankism and such, that hierarchies and elitism that comes in academics. But yeah, imposter syndrome is a real thing. I know you kind of mentioned getting used to it is a little eerie. I know for me, hearing the sound of my own voice is like, oh my God, turn it off. An idea that others will have to hear it too. So sorry to everyone, but it's like an important thing. It's so important to like get past all those things that are kind of making us feel insufficient, I guess, as far as the work and the value, because it is incredibly valuable. I mean, the podcast covers so many topics and such. What are some ideas of things on the horizon? And specifically, I know one of the main focuses is a very important issue of erasure of black women's voices and work that's been done by ethnographers, and things like this. Maybe we can talk a little bit about that as a reality in anthropology, which I know anthropology often thinks of itself as like autoimmune to its own brand of racism and cultural bias. So it's such an important thing to like bring to the head and let people have access to. So maybe we can go a little bit into depth about that history, or what's sort of the driving idea behind the podcast.
Yeah, I mean, I think that we were, well, what I was thinking as well when I came up with the name was that, Zora Neale Hurston, she was a graduate student at Columbia University in the anthropology department, and she never finished her degree. She never finished her PhD, and then she just passed away in obscurity. And despite her books and her writing being very popular during the Harlem Renaissance. And one of the things that I was thinking about is just the way that it wasn't her who failed. She wasn't, she didn't fail to graduate, but the university and the department, they failed to support her. And I really wanted to honor her and the work that she did with this name and just recognize that Brendane, myself, and all of the other Black women in the anthropology department, past and future and present, we are kind of following in this legacy of Zora Neale Hurston as an anthropologist, but also exceeding the work that she did, building off of it, but also exceeding it.
Yeah, I think one of the things that really struck me about Zora Neale Hurston's story was her commitment to her own community. And that's something that I hold especially dear, is this commitment to a larger, I guess what I imagine, a larger Black community, a larger community of Black women survivors, and always remaining accountable to them. And I think that's something that anthropology, some sectors of anthropology, I think Black feminist anthropology does a good job of remaining accountable to communities. But if I think about anthropology writ large, I always wonder when I'm reading people's work, like, okay, cool, we can move on from the human, right? We can think about post-humanism, but who does this necessarily benefit? Especially some of the ways that things are written about. Like, who does this benefit? Especially when we know that there are people, human beings, who are constantly and continuously written out of the category of the human, right? And so how does this continue to erase these people? I think about that in regards to anthropology. And I think about, to get to the kind of the first half of your question about what's on the horizon for us, we were actually talking about this a couple of days ago, just to plan. And so we're definitely going to talk about colorism and the ways that colorism can erase the voices of darker skinned folks and their experiences. And I think we are seeing, especially now, an explosion of white women being exposed for pretending to be Black. And I think that speaks to the politics of colorism within the academy. The fact that these women are academics, I think says a lot. But yeah, so we're thinking about talking about colorism and reparations and yes.
We've got religion on the horizon.
Religion.
Abolition. Because
and
I'm still learning. I'm still on my journey to that with abolition, and Brendane is definitely more there. So I think that having that conversation, between us will help a lot of people and will be interesting for people to hear. So
for sure,
that one I'm looking forward to, actually.
Me too, actually.
And immigration, we're thinking about immigration and the way that Black people are often erased from stories and understandings and like thinking around immigration. So I think that there are about 44% of people in ICE detention right now are Haitian. But that's not really the image that you see on the news and in protests. So
I didn't know that.
I think that's something that we definitely want to talk about, especially now with the stories that are coming out and about the mass hysterectomies and all of these kinds of things. So there's definitely a really great intersection of gender and race within this that we want to unpack together. And I think we're going to be reading No Humans Involved.
Yes.
We're gonna read some Winter.
Some Sylvia Winter.
It's gonna be hard.
We're going to figure it out together.
Yes.
For sure. And I think that's also one of the things that makes this work so great for us is also we try to build a collaborative space, and one that I think is not necessarily antithetical to the academy, because I think right now we're seeing an explosion in certain areas of the academy, especially among like Black feminist thinkers, where now people are trying to stake their claim and say, oh, this is my research, this is my thing, and kind of pushing graduate students out. I don't know if you saw what happened with Black in the Ivory and that whole like fiasco. And so I think also what we're trying to do is kind of reclaim some of what this is really about, which is like community and care and teaching each other, but also teaching other people. And it's really been I can't say it enough. Like, it's really been a light in my life this summer and throughout the course of this pandemic, because I don't know. I'm like, I don't know what I would do with myself or my life if I didn't have something to look forward to and didn't feel like I was doing something positive and impactful to a community. So I'm just so thankful.
That's amazing. I'm sure that not just for you, but for many others, it's been a wonderful thing to find and come upon and listen to. What have been the responses? I'm sure you've gotten folks come reach out to you and say like, oh my gosh. What are folks saying?
A lot of things. I think, I mean, majority of it is positive. We've gotten some interesting emails. I think that's something that, we might want to talk about, is just, you put yourself out. I was saying this to Brendan a few days ago, you put yourself out there as a woman, particularly a Black woman, and you say, I'm still learning, and we're all learning together. And I think that it opens a space for certain people to, for men, white men, to come and mansplain things to you or make suggestions to you, or like, have you heard about this? Have you thought about this?
Massive eye roll.
So there's that, but I think the vast majority has been positive and supportive, and just telling us how much they appreciate what we're doing and how much they learn from every episode. And for me, it has just been, as Brendan said earlier, it has just been something that has made me feel so much more confidence in speaking in academic spaces, and even in my personal and like professional relationships. So
yeah, I would say that ditto to everything that Alyssa just said. And then also what's really been amazing for me as been seeing my family, or at least some of my family members, kind of get on it. And yeah, this is like, as a first generation student, like I'm the first person in my family to go to college and to graduate, and always never, my family never really understood what I was doing. They're like, oh, you're gonna be a doctor kind of thing. And it's like, but not that kind of doctor. I read and write kind of thing. And so it's like, or I get the, you're still in school kind of response. But for my aunt, like one of the things that she said, she was like, I've been listening to your podcast and it's really been making me think about my relationships with men, and like, the past and things that they've done and that I've done. And I've really been reflecting on that. And I was just like, wow, this is a conversation that I never would have been able to have with her if I had not done this podcast. And like, because, we don't really talk about our relationships with men. When I used to date men, like I never really had conversations with my family about it, or the violence that I experienced in those relationships. And so for her, it was just like, okay, we both now know that we've experienced these similar things. So like, let's talk about it. So yeah, it's really been the conversation opener. I've also had like faculty members be like, why did I have to find out from Twitter that you do this thing? Or why did I have to find out from, so-and-so? And one of my committee members was like, yeah, somebody sent me something that you wrote and like sent me about your podcast. And she doesn't even have social media. And I'm like, I don't know if I want you to know this much about
the
my
grapevine.
life.
Yeah, it is putting yourself out there, right? It's and we know the internet is can be like a terrifying place too, of the kinds of responses you get and such. But speaking about like your work and how your own scholarship, but maybe you can tell us, because I was reading just that short bio of your work, and I was just like, oh my, I want to hear more. Maybe if you're comfortable to do so, to tell us about your own projects, because this is something you're doing on top of your own work, top of your doctoral, your all your studies. And so maybe a little bit about even the, apart from the podcast, the work that you do within anthropology.
I'm currently doing fieldwork now, so I feel like I've gone through the exam process, I've gone through the quals and all of that. So I think I could talk a little bit more about my project. But basically, my project is based in Baltimore, Maryland, and I am working with these anti-sexual violence activists here, these Black women and girls who lead movements here. I would say they call it the Me Too movement, but they've been around long before Me Too became like popularized. So thinking with them about how they use different feelings like grief or fear or anger to construct movement spaces. And then once we get into these different activists meeting movement spaces or healing spaces, what practices are done to memorialize Black women and girls who've died due to different forms of violence. And so these women see their lives as the intersections of state-sanctioned, interpersonal. And when I say interpersonal, I mean everything from sexual violence and domestic violence to kind of community violence or gang violence or drug-related violence. And then also institutional violence. So the actual day-to-day kind of environmental racism, police violence, educational violence, things that happen here in Baltimore. And so how they throw all of these things together, because they live through all of these things, right? So how do they observe all of these things together and also observe the lives of Black women and girls who died here in the city? And recently, I would say in the past few weeks, the violence actually been ramping up here. And so, and it's really unfortunate to see the number of women who have been killed in the last few weeks here in Baltimore. What's been interesting though for me as an anthropologist is that since we're in COVID, I can't really be out and about and really meeting people safely. And so now I have to figure out how to have these kind of conversations about these very vulnerable topics over, Zoom or whatever, right? And and also communicating with a population of people who might not have an internet access in the way that a Zoom conversation would even be like a good idea. Or for some of these women, right, it's not necessarily safe for them to be seen talking to a researcher about these experiences, which is par for the course when thinking about domestic violence or sexual violence. But now it's like this added layer of this pandemic makes it more complicated to navigate. And I think an extension of my work is also, I guess, theoretically thinking about what does it mean to be Black? What does it mean to feel? So what does it mean that grief, anger, and fear are experienced by these women, but aren't necessarily feelings that are recognized on a societal level unless they are connected to the killing of a Black man? And so thinking around that as well.
Respect for Brendane's work, for the work that you're doing, and that you are taking on these highly personal and personalized, this highly personalized and personal research project. I have so much respect for that, even though I think a lot of the times in anthropology and academia in general, we talk so much about things having to be objective and you need this outsider's perspective. And of course we know that that is false. And so I have a lot of respect for Brendane doing that work, keeping in mind the emotional and personal challenge that you're facing doing it. So
thinking about kind of shining a mirror in anthropology, and all the many problems that it's fraught with, including like we study things such as intersectionality, but yet our faculties are quite lacking in any form of diversity and things like this.
Don't speak too close on this.
Yeah. Things like, this is really, have you gotten this perception, which even in the work, like talking about fieldwork harassment, which I don't know, for some reason I imagined like wouldn't be a taboo. I knew it was a taboo to talk about, but I wouldn't think it would be threatening to talk about it to anthropology. I thought people were like, oh yeah, we know, let's do something. But like it feels like people take a threat that we're somehow, fieldwork is so highly held, and anthropologists pride themselves in fieldwork, and it's like, oh, we can't do anything to change our approaches of how things have classically been done, and this is our tradition. Like, have these conversations been, you said you've been supported in general, but thinking about like the changing directions in anthropology, like what do you see as far as moving forward, like how we can really make changes in this domain, which is so fraught with so many problems and is a very racist and classist, elitist, I mean, the whole nine yards. We've got, and yet people don't have that perception. It's like, we're anthropologists. No, we don't engage in these things. What are your thoughts just about like maybe the future of anthropology and where we want to take it?
Yeah, I think we need to get out of our minds that the field worker is someone who is always in control. I think that's a largely white and masculinist view of what makes a good field worker. I think that, as I was saying just now, objectivity and looking at things from this outside kind of view is not where we need to continue moving forward with the field, right? It's taking into account what kind of Black feminist practices. It's about care and being close to your interlocutors in more than just a physical proximity kind of way. And also what the pandemic is showing us is that proximity, like physical proximity, isn't always going to be possible. Yeah, it's not guaranteed. And I think, what you were saying, Jericho, was really interesting, that you're surprised, or you've kind of been surprised, that it was difficult to talk to anthropologists about, gendered and sexual violence, particularly in the field. And I think for me, nobody ever told me specifically not to talk about the sexualized harassment I experienced in the field, but I just knew that I shouldn't. It's like this compulsory silence is tacit in so many ways. It's very present in its absence in ethnographies and in journal articles. People don't really talk about that. And then another thing was just that I never felt like my experiences were serious enough to be worthy of speaking about, because it pales in comparison to what other people in the field, I'm sure, have experienced. So I think that that's how those systems of silencing work, right? It's like they make you quantify harm to determine who's worthy of being taken seriously. But I think we need to acknowledge and really internalize that all of these experiences are part of the same systems of patriarchal violence.
Right. And I would say that, interestingly, for me, someone who has endured violence practically my entire life, different forms of violence my entire life, my brain, when I, was like, oh, I'm going to do field work, I thought for some reason that I was going to be exempt from violence, even though my project is about Black women experiencing violence and harassment. And so I would go out to like different places to meet people. This was pre-COVID. I don't do that now, y'all. But like pre-COVID, was out places, meeting people, would meet men. And like my first summer, experienced an issue with a person stalking me. Second summer, assault, harassment, and realizing and having a conversation with my advisor. And he was just like, you have to write yourself into these experiences. And me wanting to be this like, well, as a researcher, I can't write myself into these experiences, but then also being like, well, actually I have to, as a Black woman, and having that like on the ground realization that like people don't see me, and they don't see like Columbia Anthropology written across my forehead, like do not touch, do not buy, like, they're not gonna respect this thing that I put in my mind that they're supposed to respect, right? They're going to see me as a Black woman. And if these are men who do harm to women on a daily, I look like those women that they do harm to. I mean, what else can I expect, right? Like my academy affiliation is not going to protect me from that. And so coming to that realization, and then having to rethink, okay, how am I going to actually go about field work now that I realize that like I'm putting myself in danger by asking these questions, by being in certain places. And so having to do a whole research design around that violence was something that I had to accommodate and think about. And I think for anthropologists in general, thinking about like in the future, especially for the future of the discipline, because the discipline is focused on, I think as Alyssa said beautifully, like this kind of like masculinist narrative of being in control. And so in order for you to even say that, you kind of have to occlude some of your identities that make it like impossible for you to control what happens to you. And so I think about these these Black women ethnographers that I read who, you know, do work in all these different places. And I think about how I would say almost none of them have written about violence that they themselves have experienced in the field. And knowing that would be the contribution and that my dissertation would necessitate, scares me a little bit, I would say, to be honest. But after last summer, after realizing that, like, there was this, so I don't know if y'all have seen The Wire, but on The Wire, they would have these like young boys who they would call them lookout boys, and they would stay on the corner and look out for the police. Not all of them are young. And so we had a lookout boy outside the place that I was staying last summer, and he was probably like 18, 19, whatever. And I didn't realize that he was watching me until he said something to me one day. And I was just like, oh, you know, hi, and be nice to you, whatever, whatever. And then of course he crossed that boundary into harassment. And he knew where I lived. So it wasn't like I could really, you know, turn the computer off and get away or like get away. It's like he literally stands outside of my apartment. And so learning how to navigate that was a challenge, but thankfully I didn't have to navigate it for too long because it was kind of towards the end of my fieldwork when he started speaking to me. But that's something that I have to write about and theorize in some way when I'm thinking about fear and thinking about emotion, right? It's my own fear in feeling like I couldn't even enter into the place that I lived, or I had to feel like I had to come home at different times so I could avoid seeing him. And even, yeah, so like those are the things that no one teaches in a fieldwork methods class, right? So maybe anthropologists need to think about if we're really going to be that discipline that pushes the academy forward and really, like if we're the storytellers, right? We're the storytellers, we're the lived experience experts, like we actually have to be real about lived experience being varied and diverse, and making our fieldwork courses reflect that. But who's ready to have that conversation? I don't know.
Exactly. Yeah. This is another bizarre thing is like pre-fieldwork trainings, we get a lot of pushback that like, no, we can't do that. And I still can't grasp why about fieldwork and like the realistic concerns that folks experience and the things that people encounter. And we've even been told, both for the issue of sexual harassment, for the issue of racism, for the issue of transphobia, like, well, we don't want to talk about that because we might dissuade people of color or trans anthropologists or women from doing field work. So like it's a very bizarre and backwards approach, and like letting folks know about these realities and being willing to have these conversations. I mean, even I think it was, I don't even know, not that long ago, 2009, sociologist called Frances Henderson wrote a piece, "We Thought You'd Be White," about what it is to go abroad to do field work, and you're emailing with people, and suddenly when you arrive and they see that you're a woman of color, or they're not what you imagine, because they have this very colonial idea in their mind of who does field work, like the whole dynamics have shifted. And it's like, even when people write about it, it becomes shelved. It's like, okay, great, you wrote a paper, let's put it on the bookshelf, but like nothing ever there's no actual this is what we want to do. And kind of what was at the heart of it is like changing how we approach it and needing support through awareness. Like we have to talk about these things, which is why conversations are like so important. But also, kind of piggybacking off what you said, Alyssa, this is the most common thing we see, is that people say like, oh no, I don't want to reach out for help because like, yeah, I wasn't like, they imagine that fieldwork harassment or violence or assault has to be like somebody holding a gun to your head or something, when we know it's like many things. Any form of an individual feeling unsafe, even if nothing happens, the worry that something might happen, or that feeling of lack of safety, knowing someone's watching you, for example, like in your story, that's trauma. And people feeling like, oh, they're not really worthy, and that it's thought of as unprofessional to talk about it. Even we're now living in a time where even talking about Black Lives Matter is thought of as too political and unprofessional and outside the domain. So it's really, there's really so many ways in which I think just a real honest conversation and people listening and open and willing to have it is like super important. But yeah, okay, so thinking just about how can folks connect with the podcast, and like, because I want to be mindful of your time, what can people do to connect with you? How can how can everybody access it? I know it's online, but maybe we can talk about what people can do to support the podcast, and any last and final thoughts about this work, and just in general. I'll hand it over to both of you.
Yeah, I did want to say that actually our most recent episode that just came out on Wednesday, and we had our first guest as well, so that was very exciting. But it was actually about the allegations against professors at Harvard, in the Harvard Anthropology department. And I'm just bringing this up because for one of the women in one of the more recent articles that came out, her harassment started in the field. And so I think on the episode, I called it the Harvard scandal, or, we were like, okay, we'll just say, the Harvard scandal. But I really meant that with scare quotes, because it's not really a scandal per se because of how common sexual harassment in academia, in the field actually is. And I think that we need to refuse the shock and awe of harm against women in academic institutions. I think that this has been happening for a long time. It's something that people have known about, that people perpetuate and are complicit in with their silence. And then they kind of treat it as though, professors, the faculty, they treat it as though it's part of the experience of the PhD, of being in the ivory tower and all of these kinds of things, that it's, an initiation into the discipline, which is also what they say is what fieldwork is. This is like your initiation period into the discipline. And so the sexual harassment that women, queer folks experience is hazing. And I think Greg Beckett, he phrased it really well. He called it cruelty that masquerades as intellectual rigor, which I think was fantastic. So I did just want to say that, because it brings together our conversation really well. And so that latest episode you can find.
I got so excited, when I saw that, especially the talk. The topics aren't exciting, but that these conversations being had are very, very, very important. And also the burden that, like if it happens to you, like what you said, there's kind of this like feeling like, don't say anything, even though no one explicitly says it, because you're made to feel like the problem student. And if you're already like a historically underrepresented member, like as a former foster, this like you already should be happy to be here. You're like, just be lucky to be here. And
what is it that Sarah Ahmed said? When you speak out against the problem, you become the problem.
Yeah, exactly.
And I always think about that, the feminist killjoy line. I think about that often.
Yeah, I would say, find us. We're at zorasdaughters.com. The podcast is on basically all the platforms that you listen to podcasts. And just in connection to, I guess, to think about closing thoughts, because there's something that I think about, especially since I do affect theory, I think about a lot is that there are people whose experiences, even if they do have an identity that is marginalized, for example, like white women's experiences with sexual violence may be erased in certain contexts, but are also, we live in a society in a context in which their experiences are anticipated, right? And their bodies are protected in certain ways. And so I think about that when I think about like my hesitancy to report is not necessarily because I don't think that people are going to like, I understand that people are not going to rush to my defense. I'm going to say it like that. And so my hesitancy to report is like, do I even put myself through the rigmarole of like going through and detailing what happened to me when I know that people are going to, because I am Black and because I am a Black woman, going to say, well, isn't that part and parcel of your life? And part of that like recognition, right, is what makes me Black, right? And it's what marks Blackness on my body. And so I think about that too. And I mean, that's like part of my work. And so I think that when we talk about like violence as being part of this initiation process, it's like, again, I start thinking about these like white men who are anthropologists who don't have to deal with this, who can just like literally read and write and do their dissertation. And it's like, well, wait, like, what is that like? Like, what is that like? I just want to know, not that I want to be you because that's impossible, but like, I just want to know what it's like to just like, to literally just be a student, you know, but I also recognize that the institution was built and centers that experience. So that's why they're able to do that. And so in order for,
even our,
I was going to say like,
sorry. I have a delay in my
I was going
headphones.
to say, in order
Please.
for that to change, like we really have to shift these institutions and remove this idea of centering and marginalization, because honestly, it's messed up for people to be like, we don't want to explain that you're going to experience violence because that might discourage people. And it's like, no, I actually live that experience every day. Please tell me so that I can protect myself. Because you're not going to protect me. So tell me so I can protect myself. But yeah, go.
Yeah, I was just gonna kind of say that with anthropology, it blows my mind when we look at like what are thought of as the founders of the field, and like even their field work. Like they took a boat to the Amazon, they stayed for a week, they didn't have any connections, they just observed people, and then they wrote the books that would later be and like these are revered and boosted, and we even have whole classes learning their biographies. Like when it is mind blowing to think of how fieldwork it caters to a white cis elite children of the elite sort of male thing. That was just one thing. And also how even the solutions for like solutions, I say in quotes because they're not, but what might happen is if you say that you experience fieldwork harassment, they'll say go to police, and this is not safe. Like we know police are not an ally, especially not for people of color at all by any means. That puts them in more danger. And so like it just is really yet there's a failure to even acknowledge and accept it, and you write about it and then it'll be an article in some feminist journal, and then it just nothing happens. And so anyway, sorry to interrupt you, but it's very much on point to like fill the things that we want to change as far as how we approach pedagogy and fieldwork through Fieldwork Initiative, because I'm like, we have classes about the biography of Marcel Mauss, but like we can't talk about harassment in fieldwork. But please, you were I interrupted you because and again, sorry, I have a delay in my headphones, so it is a very annoying feature. But you were talking also about the podcast, how people can support it too, or whatever, final thoughts
how
you
people
want to
can
share.
support us. The best thing you can do is rate us, give us 5 stars, nothing less.
And the review. People are giving us the ratings, but they haven't left a little review on iTunes. We need that. It definitely helps with the visibility.
Yeah, and so that's the algorithm thing. You have to like do the review, and then also just like, I know we talked about emails earlier, but we do appreciate the emails, especially when they're done in the right spirit. And so just like, even if it's like you send an email to us and saying, hey, I heard this was really great. We do want to be in conversation. What we don't want to do is be, mansplained to, or kind of, no one wants to be mansplained to. So that is one way to support us. We also, we accept donations through our PayPal link, which you can find on our website. And you can like do lots of things. Please tell your friends about us. Follow us on social media at Zora's Daughters on Instagram, and Zora's __ daughters on Twitter. I always say it like that, so because I like saying underscore. And join us in the conversation. I think also just largely, if we're thinking about supporting us as Black women, please educate yourself in this moment on all the different things that are happening and ways that you can push back and fight back, because unless we do something to stop it, this world it's not going to get any better. And I've come to that realization over and over again. Like, we have to actively fight. It's much more than writing, and as you're saying, Jerica, like it's much more than writing an article and putting it on a shelf. Like, we have to really think about, as anthropologists, what does it mean to do the work? And it can't just be writing about it and moving forward.
Absolutely. Yes, we're going to have the link posted below for the Twitter. We want to have the link for the donation. This work is labor that folks do to educate others, and it's very important that it's supported. There's no excuses for anybody on Twitter or social media to be like making ignorant comments, because there are podcasts that you can listen to and educate yourself. And all of it. We want folks to connect and listen, and really it's very illuminating. And we just thank you so much for this work and for this conversation and all of it. So wonderful. I don't know if there's any other final thoughts before we say thank you for your time. But we'll be sharing the episodes as they come out. And you know, again, the importance of supporting this work cannot be understated. So thank you, both of you, Brendane and Alyssa, for this work and for being here with me today. Despite all of my glitches and my
please don't
It's okay.
apologize. You show up as yourself. Please do it
Yes.
unapologetically, please.
So I will say the first podcast that I ever did, I have a delay of like 3 seconds. So I think someone's finished and then I'm like, and it was like both of us starting and stopping at the same time. So it's a revival of the early days, which were only last month. But thank you very much for, for in general, all gratitude to you. And we want folks to boost you, write comments. If I heard correctly, we want comments, we want feedback, we want emails, we want all the whole 9 yards, because it's really, really, really important to support this and boost it and make sure this is accessible to everyone to listen to and collaborate with. So thank you very much for signing off.